You are listening to the Intelligence Studies Podcast, a co-production of the Department of Intelligence and Security Studies at Coastal Carolina University and the Research Institute for European and American Studies. We explore the connections between the study and practice of intelligence in the domestic and international security environment of our time.
Welcome all to the Intelligence Studies Podcast. This is our second edition. My name is Jonathan Smith. I am actually the chair of the Department of Intelligence and Security Studies at Coastal Carolina University. I'm joined today by our Professor Mark Chandler. Professor Mark Chandler joined Coastal 2 years ago, and he has served as our professor of practice since that time. Before then, he had 37 years in defense intelligence. He served for 21 years as a Marine Corps intelligence officer, having served both in Operation Desert Storm and in Operation Iraqi Freedom. After that, and after retiring from the Marines, he joined the Civilian Defense Intelligence Service and served as the chief of the Middle East and Africa Center at DIA, as well as serving as the Deputy Intelligence Chief, J2, at the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So, Mark, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I wanted to start with the news that we had this morning that the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, is not going to have a meeting with his counterpart, the Chinese defense minister, over Chinese protests with regard to U.S. sanctions. I wanted to kind of get your take about how you'd assess the U.S.-Chinese relationship and where you think it's going.
Well, John, I think that's a good question right now for the current strategic environment that we find ourselves in. I do want to say I believe China's taken a hard line, and they feel they have a position right now to take that. Now, if we trace this back, that really goes back to the balloon incident and them being, I guess you would say, internationally embarrassed by being caught with that surveillance balloon that flew across the United States. The United States came out, rightfully so, talked about violation of sovereign airspace, violation of our ability for freedom of maneuver, freedom of action, and then shot the balloon down. China, obviously, part of their process is deny and deflect. And so they are taking a very hardline approach at this point, pushing back on the United States. Where we are in those relations, I think perilous would be a good thing, a good word to describe it at this stage. I don't want to be over dramatic in saying the word perilous, but right now China's at an advantage. The United States is going to them trying to mend some fences, and I'll give you my opinion as opposed to a factual based thing, but it should be China mending fences with the United States after the blatant violation of sovereign airspace with that balloon. However, China's taken the higher road. We're in a strategic competition, and I think China feels it has the ability to take these actions and push back on what the United States is trying to do is create that diplomatic opening again with China.
Understand. One of the things with regard to this strategic competition that I think doesn't get enough attention is the rise of the Chinese military over the past decade. Could you speak to, how you see that developing, and particularly whether they are, in fact, a true peer to U.S. military power?
Well, I think to look at today's Chinese military, we need to go back. This is 2023, so we need to go back to before 2010. And we need to look at some Chinese stated objectives at that time. When I look at this situation and what China said, and I can talk about this later, but we need to understand that China means what it says, but we don't always understand how they're telling us what they're going to do. So back at that time, they had an objective, and this was before 2010, to have the military capability to be able to take Taiwan by force if needed by 2020. And so they incrementally built their military capability, whether it's missile forces, naval forces, air forces, and ground forces, in that process to be able to take Taiwan, be able to stop the United States from interfering with China's ability to do that. Now, in the middle 2010s, they had some setbacks. So I think their current timeline to have the full military capability is by about 2025 to 2027. That's the window that they're looking at it. And as a matter of fact, President Xi of China has publicly stated that in the last several months. Since the last party Congress, when he was reelected, he's got he essentially is ruler for life now in China. So they have incrementally built this military capability, and they've studied our way of fighting to be able to counter everything that we have done in fighting conflicts since the 1990s, since Desert Shield, Desert Storm. How we fight, China is building a capability to defend against that.
Gotcha. And so with regard to the Taiwan issue, so you think at the moment they would not be able to launch a successful strike against Taiwan?
I think that they could launch a very destructive and successful strike against Taiwan with the forces they have today. The objective, and we have to realize the elements of national power, military, and economics, they don't want to destroy Taiwan economically because they need some of the technological capabilities that are resident on the island. So could they take Taiwan and destroy it today? Yes. Do they want to destroy it? No. So I think what you'll see is an increased pressure about and around Taiwan. They could actually choke it off with a significant naval blockade and not allow exports out or imports in, and that could slowly choke Taiwan without necessarily having to fire a shot.
Right. Another part of the U.S.-Chinese relationship that, of course, got a lot of attention, and you mentioned it previously, was this balloon incident. And again, just dumb luck that when the balloon was actually shot down, it was shot down directly over Myrtle Beach. So a lot of folks in our program actually got to witness that piece directly. A number of people have described this as kind of a Sputnik moment, the idea that it would bring home to the American public the idea of the role or the potential threat that China could play. I wondered if you could speak to that issue. Do you agree with that?
Well, in regards to the Sputnik moment, I agree it was a good incident for the American population to see China's blatant actions. And so their aggressive approach, assertive approach to military capabilities and actions against the United States were wide out in the open, what it's done over the last decade or so. But they've, as I mentioned before, been incrementally increasing their capability. They've been spying on us. Obviously, they have space technology, the ability to gather information, but they took this bold action, and the American public was able to see once and for all through China's action what they've been doing. I mean, they've been stealing our technology. They've been working against us economically. They've got one of the largest human campaigns internal to the United States and some other destabilizing effect. They have interfered with our elections in not so subtle ways that doesn't get enough press, such as the Russian interference that we see. So I think that's good for the American public to see. We just need to make sure they maintain awareness of it before it's too late. We need to pay attention to this strategic threat that China presents.
Right. I definitely agree. So you mentioned earlier the idea that we should take the Chinese position that they publicly stated at face value. Like the old cliche, if somebody tells you who they are, you should believe them. So with regard to that, I think there's, at least amongst the U.S. population, a lack of understanding of Chinese culture and Chinese society that might help them to understand the rationale behind the Chinese behavior. Do you agree with that? The idea of the idea that society and culture can be a driver?
Absolutely. I firmly believe that we, especially in the intelligence community, need to understand and present to our decision makers, the policymakers, a better understanding of I don't want to say adversarial because they're not all adversarial, but other cultures and societies. Some of what Xi is doing now is rooted back thousands of years to great Chinese dynasties that existed. Now, when I say dynasty and controlling their world, obviously the world was different thousands of years ago, so they controlled their sphere of influence. And for China, that would be the Middle Kingdom. What China wants to do, they don't necessarily want to confront the U.S. globally. They don't want to attack the continental United States, but they want and believe from their culture that they are the supreme power in all of Asia. That's South Asia, Southwest Asia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Ocean. That is their territory, not to be interfered with by anyone outside of that sphere. So they have talked about that. That has been a continuing theme. We need to appreciate that history and that culture that the Chinese bring to that and how that is rooted in their objectives that they want to achieve. Without understanding that culture, we may not understand the seriousness of how that they intend to do this and that is their objective.
You are listening to the Intelligence Studies Podcast, a co-production of the Department of Intelligence and Security Studies at Coastal Carolina University and the Research Institute for European and American Studies.
Professor Chandler, Mark, one area related to that, of course, the issue of cyber gets a lot of attention with respect to our relationship with China. And recently, the Biden administration put out a new national cyber strategy. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that this is an adequate response?
Well, overall with cyber, and I'll editorialize here just a moment, is a lot of people don't understand the significant threat in the cyber sphere at this stage. We are engaged in conflict, might be too strong a word, but it might not be strong enough a word, with our adversaries, Russia, China. Let's look at Iran. We can even go to North Korea. That we are confronted with attacks on a daily basis against our infrastructure, probing attacks against our Department of Defense, our State Department, our economic side of our power are all under some sort of barrage, if you will, today. So having a cyber strategy is critical. But more important is taking that strategy and operationalizing it. And I think that's where we may have a little bit of a weak link currently. We need a cyber czar. The Department of Defense, through Cybercom and the National Security Agency, have the strongest cyber capability for our government. However, they're limited in what they can do domestically. So now we have, under DHS, we have DISA, which is responsible for cyber protection and the infrastructure protection in the United States. But they don't have the requisite skill sets or capabilities as, say, such NSA or Cybercom. So we need to bring DISA up more. I don't want to be completely negative. DISA has made significant strides in the last 4 to 5 years on its capabilities, but we need to make American universities, American businesses, power companies, we need to make our entire infrastructure process more aware of cyber, and the government needs to be more open and proactive in ensuring that we protect that critical infrastructure before it's too late. And we see constant, as I said, barrages on a daily basis against all elements of our national power, if you will, from our cyber adversaries. And China is one of the premier cyber operators in the world.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. One of the things I find fascinating when we talk about U.S. intelligence is, again, we've got this strong inclination since the creation of the intelligence community for that foreign domestic divide, that there should be kind of something of a bright line between them. And yet, as we've moved into the 21st century with threats like terrorism and now cyber, that these are threats which transcend that foreign domestic boundary, and that sometimes we find ourselves a little bit of a disadvantage in trying to adhere to that older concept, which has some good principles behind it, but may not be the best or might not be appropriate towards the current security environment.
Exactly. I mean, there were certain things when I was still practicing in the Department of Defense that we could see happening via the Department of Defense, but could take no action, and there wasn't a requisite or skilled domestic capability to hand that over to. And so trying to stay within the legal bounds of the Constitution and our nation's laws, now you're walking a fine line there.
Yeah, definitely agree. Hey, with regard, I wanted to move on to another topic before we run out of time. Certainly the Russia-Ukraine conflict is getting a lot of attention these days. Again, that conflict has been going on now for certainly the most recent phase for more than a year. And you're our professor of intelligence and war, right? You've taught that class, right? I guess I'd like to ask you, what do you think we're learning about war as a result of this conflict?
Well, I think what we're learning, and not to be trite, but war is hell. And when you look at what is happening to Ukraine as a nation, the Ukrainian people, I mean, you're looking at some complete destruction across some of those cities. I mean, Bakhmut, pretty much a wasteland of destruction. And that's the Russian way of fighting. They did it in Georgia. We watched them do it all the time in Syria in their support of the Assad regime. Some beautiful cities just destroyed. So I think war is ugly. I also think that if we underestimate our adversaries, as I believe we did with Putin, and try to reason that they're going to behave the same way we would, we call that mirror imaging in the intelligence community and in our classroom. If we try to do that, we're going to underestimate our opponent. Now, I also think we're gaining valuable insight from this Ukrainian tragedy, and that is the weakness of the Russian military. They're active. They're going through thousands of personnel losses through killed in action. They are using the Wagner group. They're pretty much military contractors, if you will, that they've used in Syria, Libya, and several other countries in Africa to further their foreign policy. And I think what we're seeing is a weaker Russian military than people first gave them credit for. If you're asking my opinion and my thoughts, we need to continue to push to support Ukraine and push back against the Russian military in this, in the hopes, and hope is not a plan. And you're a Navy intelligence officer, and you always hear hope is not a course of action or a plan, but somehow support the Ukrainians and stopping the Russians and perhaps pushing them back. And we'll see how well the recent acquisition of tanks for the Ukrainian military does in their counteroffensive that's planned here very soon. But we have to look at how Russia's fighting wars. One thing that surprised me is the significant use of drone for attacks. I mean, if you go back 10 years, they didn't exist in a barrage attack. The United States was the premier user of drones for counterterrorism. And now you see Iran supplying Russia with drones to conduct massive attacks, especially like they did on Kiev. So there's a lot that we can learn, and we need to be prepared because if Ukraine falls, it is not trite to say that Russia and Putin will be emboldened to take further actions against Europe.
Yeah, I definitely would agree. And again, the use of drone technology has been fascinating to watch. Again, the nature of the conflict is in some ways familiar and in some ways very different as new technologies are put on the battlefield, and as they're used on the battlefield, that the combatants become more skilled at using them. One other point I wanted to ask about with respect to this, we were just talking about China and Taiwan. Some had suggested that maybe Russia's experience in Ukraine would be a useful lesson, that maybe the Chinese are learning something as well. And I wondered if you could speak to that.
No, yes, I think the Chinese are getting a PhD level course in warfighting technology. They're looking at what works for Russia, what doesn't work for Russia, how the West is responding. So if I look at it militarily on the ground, they're seeing how the weapons function and how well they work. They're looking at objectives. Everyone at the start of the Ukrainian campaign, when Russia invaded Ukraine the second time, they said Ukraine will fall in a month, or it won't last 6 weeks. And then all of a sudden it turned. So I think overestimating an adversary's capabilities, as everyone overestimated Russia, China can now look at that. Do they need to make tweaks to their command and control, and perhaps how they are going to fight a war against Taiwan? And more importantly, how they'll push back against the United States. Diplomatically, I think China probably has had its eyes open to how Europe has coalesced in a group against Russia and in support of Ukraine, and how the United States has been developing or redeveloping its partnerships in Asia. What are our close allies doing with Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines? We've re-engaged with the Philippines after a couple of decades of not having close relationships. How does that play against China's ability to secure, say, the South China Sea and Taiwan in any kind of conflict or near conflict? So I think it's a great opportunity for China to learn militarily and diplomatically, and then economically. Look at how the sanctions affected Russia, affects their economy, and then what might happen should China blockade or invade Taiwan.
Right. I definitely agree. One last question I wanted to ask. I know you just recently finished a new class for our program on intelligence applications. Given all the things that are going on in the world today, do you see much use for them in the classroom?
Absolutely. And I have to appreciate what's going on in the world, because what that does and what today's current world does, it allows our students, and you mentioned the Intel and War class, Russia invaded Ukraine during that class, and it was a great real life experience to put the students through. During this past spring semester, the students, what I would do is use real life examples of what's taking place and force them to think through the process and then build summaries and write about that. And they were challenged, I believe, because they said, well, this is very new. This is happening now. The point is, that's what intelligence analysts face on a daily basis, the brand new, the pop-ups, and trying to learn as we go. The students struggled, but I believe loved what they were doing in that applications and in that war class, because they were able to see not theoretical, but real life examples, and then meld that into what they would be doing as practicing intelligence professionals. So while I might hope that the world has peace, while it has some discontent and there's conflict that's ever present, we take those real life examples and we can apply that through the classes. And I believe the students are going to benefit from those real life experiences and applying that to their trade.
Yeah. Thank you for speaking with me today, Mark. And thank you for all that you do for our program. And to our audience, thank you for joining us for the Intelligence Studies podcast. Again, it's a co-production of the Intelligence and Security Studies Department at Coastal Carolina University and the Research Institute for the European and American Studies. So thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you for listening to the Intelligence Studies Podcast, a co-production of the Department of Intelligence and Security Studies at Coastal Carolina University and the Research Institute for European and American Studies. To find out more about intelligence and security studies at Coastal Carolina University, go to coastal.edu/intelligence. For more about the Research Institute for European and American Studies, visit rieas.gr.